morning. Welcome to another installment of Profiles in Tacticalness. So today, as for request, we will be talking about the Hawkmen, the bird people, whatever you really want to call them. Essentially, they're the winged people that have been around since the beginning of the series, and long story short, they've pretty much always been pretty astoundingly useful. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and start back in both Ogre Battle games, since they didn't exactly change very much between the two. So we start off with the basic Hawkmen. Essentially, they just allowed you to have a class that could do some pretty decent damage at both front and back rows. Essentially having originally starting off with a club attack from the back row, as well as from the front row, and then getting a magical ability as time went on. You basically could go from Hawkman to Eagleman to Ravenman, and at each step of the way, they would become that much better. So, yeah, long story short, they were pretty decently tough. They were pretty useful all around, and usually you start off with Canopus pretty early on if you manage to do his side quest, which gave you access to a good little flying squad that would usually be able to go and take faraway cities without too much fuss. Typically, if you wanted to have a squad that would essentially be able to fly really fast and also still have a full 5-member team, it would be the way to go. Essentially, otherwise you were limited to something like, say, putting a bunch of people on the back of a griffin, in which case you had fewer units overall, so fewer attacks in that squad. So if they were outclassed in any way, you couldn't really make up for it in numbers. Now, they looked a little bit like this, essentially looking like, well, exactly as you'd expect. They're bird people, they've got wings, they go flappy-like, and in this case, they will more than likely get completely chewed up by this particular octopus. I don't really know why I have them all fight this giant octopus, because they pretty much always lose. But at any rate, yeah, this is what they look like. They go up, they swing their club at things. They're kind of like flying cave people in the original Ogre Battle games. It's kind of an odd thing. But at any darn rate, Ravenmen are probably the best way to go. Surprisingly, you can actually get Ravenmen a few maps into March of the Black Queen. Specifically, if you know the werewolf map, there are Ravenmen that will actually spawn in that particular area. So they're pretty useful to have there. Moving on to the version from the SNES, they basically got a wind ability to them. They became far more attuned with the wind element in general, since they had more of a fireball type thing earlier on. So at that point they got the Thunder Arrow, once they got to, I believe it was level 15 or so, which gave them a sort of missile ability that they could use at long range, but it did end up hurting them. Same thing goes for the Knight of Lotus version, where it was basically actually, no, the self-damaging version was a completely different attack. I apologize. So the Thunder Arrow was basically a charge-up, ranged missile type ability. They specialized in using hammers, although by and large they were far better off being stuff like archers. It's unclear to me why exactly they would end up going to use clubs and hammers and all that sort of thing. Given that they're flying around the entire time, it seems like a little bit of an odd choice, I would think, personally. But, whatever floats their particular boat. Specifically, halt hammers are something that they're always carrying around, so they're a rock-smashing hammer. So, I guess they really need to smash rocks wherever they're from. But then, stuff gets a little bit weirder once we get to something like, the PSP remake. So, in this one, I'm actually going to go ahead and switch over to the old PSP thing here right away. So, when it came to this version, I apologize, I had it a little bit wrong there. So when it came to this version, they got access to a bunch of different abilities. They weren't just one race and one class and all that sort of thing anymore. So they got access to a whole bunch of things here, starting off with the Warrior, the Archer, the Wizard, Cleric, Spellblade, and Beast Tamer, and Vartan. So Vartan was the first one that you got access to. It was essentially a lightweight skirmisher unit, but a little bit of an odd duck. So we'll go over here to Canopus to show this off. So the Vartan was essentially a class that specialized in using a ranged weapon in one hand and a melee weapon in another. But you could give them things like, for example, crossbows. You could give them heavier hammers and all that sort of thing. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that Canopus was known to carry around a spear in the original SNES game, the Vartan could not actually carry a spear, despite being, the class that's basically associated with him. I'm not entirely sure why that's the case. I will say that's something that One Vision corrected. But yeah, a little bit of an odd choice there. Now, his default setup is a one-handed axe with a short bow. Thing is, short bows stop being useful about halfway through the game, since, they just basically stop getting upgrades for whatever reason. And on top of that, the axes, by and large, are just something that doesn't scale up terribly well at all. Actually, one-handed axes in particular just really don't hold up past the beginning of the game. So his default setup doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. By and large, what you'd probably end up doing, like I said earlier, probably go, if you're going to stick with a short bow build on him, probably just keep a Balder bow on him. Even though it's not the highest tier type of thing that you can give him, at the very least it would allow him to use a dagger in the other hand. He can do pretty decent damage with the dagger. He can still do pretty decent damage with the Balder bow against undead things. As far as his abilities went, his first ability allowed him to do stagger and air reverse on stuff. Yay, I guess. You had to go right up to somebody to make that actually work. His secondary ability that he got later on allowed him to do air touch as well as true strike on those around him. Pretty useful. Could be pretty useful. There are other ways to instill buffs at that point, but that's one of the few mass instill modes that's available that's not on a monster class. But still, odds are you'd probably end up going with a crossbow on this guy, just because short bows end up dropping off so sharply. Now, looking at the rest of these classes, though, something like the warrior ends up working pretty well, allows you to have somebody that can fly around and hit stuff from the back row. Archers were by far the best choice for these guys, since for all intents and purposes they were the same as the human version of these classes, they just could fly. Why exactly they haven't taken over everything, who even knows? But a Hawkman Archer was astoundingly useful. Having them as a caster, not so much. Given that they're flying around, this oftentimes leads to them being exposed. So if you made them into a wizard standing on top of a roof, odds are an archer would look at that and think, oh yeah, that's a pretty tempting little pincushion right there, and just go ahead and take them right the hell out. Looking at something like the cleric, you really wouldn't bother with them for a person, so I don't see why anybody would ever bother with them for a Hawkman. They just stop being useful past the first chapter. Something like the Spellblade, I mean, I guess it's okay, they've got HP infusion to keep them going, but still not, you know, just not really, it's not really going to be doing the same oomph that the Archer has. And then the Beast Tamer is probably one of the more useful options, because you would essentially be able to fly in, get a hit, maybe get your TP charged up, maybe go back and empower a monster unit on the next turn. Again, still kind of more risky than just having them as a very well-placed archer. And then Canopus got access to the Buccaneer once you were later in the game. This is a pretty fun class to have with him, essentially just a more gun-based version of the Vartan for all intents and purposes. It's fun, but again, pistols, same thing as short bows, just basically stop getting upgrades later on, so they're just going to drop off in usefulness very tremendously. Alright, so that more or less covers everything about the Hawkmen and the PSP remake. You know, they're essentially like people archers, but they can become better, so make them archers. Why would you do anything else? But now we talk about the amazingness that is One Vision. So, what's changed with the Vartan, first of all? Well, his two abilities, Huapango and Alcolas, have been way more useful. So the first one he gets is Huapango Winds. He is a dedicated harassment unit at this point. So short bows and one-handed weapons are useful all game. They do continue getting upgrades. They're useful all the friggin' way through. So Huapango Winds gives him sidestep and renewal. This allows him to go and harass units off at the flanks while generally doing a good job of avoiding arrows and then recovering out of whatever arrows he can't avoid. His next ability here is El Colas, which gives him resilience and increases his movement range. Now, this is one that's absolutely fantastic, for example, for just mage hunting. So you have him, you know, let's say you have him off on the flanks or whatever else, and you see an opportunity to go take out one of the back row casters, you would put this on, have him fly up into a group of casters or whatever else, you know, take an axe to somebody or whatever else, you know, maybe take a hammer, whatever he happens to be carrying at the time, and yeah, so he can use that 2 extra tile range to fly in there, get some hits off, do a bit of harassment and all that. You probably want to keep Huapango Winds operating at all times, so this will allow him to essentially reflect off whatever damage comes his way magic-wise, avoid anything coming ranged-wise, and generally just stay far away from anything melee-wise. So, you know, very, very strong combo there. In case he ends up getting hobbled, leadened, or bound, while he's off doing his adventures. He also has Feather Step on him, fantastically useful. Fey Pact if you want to have fairies in your party. Reflect Damage and Magic, just whichever one you really prefer there. Tactician, very useful on him, just for the obvious reasons that he has 2 skills he wants to keep going all the time. Personally, I feel you can get enough damage going with him to not necessarily need those, though. You've got your usual wards, efficacy, and clarity if you want to have him be a caster as well. He's got the full power of all the counter hits here. He's got all of the instills available to him. He's got parry, deflect, and overpower like everybody else, his usual augments. Usually augment air is where you want to end up going with him, because that is his usual theme here. And then weapon-wise, he's got fists, daggers, axes, spears, hammers, cudgels, sidearms, bows, and crossbows. So personally, I prefer a short bow and axe build on him at this point. Just because axes are good for reducing defense. So for example, if he does end up getting caught out by a melee character, there's a pretty decent chance that he'll be able to reduce their defense while continuing to go around harassing. I like to use him as a harassment and rescue type of unit, but bear in mind, he is a lot squishier now. So you have air magic on him as well. You've got basic buffs on him, basic level buffs and missile abilities. So if we go over here to his magic availability, for example, he's got all 3 ranks of Deadshot, Air Burst, and Grace. So whatever fills the slot for the respective buff for that particular element, that's what you'd end up getting, the Burst ability, and then your first 3 missile abilities. Now, as far as equipment goes, like I said, this is a dagger type of build. Personally, I prefer axes on this guy. This is just a save that I happen to have around, so something like this. But this is a good way to do it. He gets access to most medium and light level armors. Later on, though, or rather earlier on, he only has access to stuff like leathers and whatnot. He doesn't get access to a lot of the heavier stuff. So until you get to things like Crucible and all that, he won't actually have access to a lot of leggings, but try to keep his evasion as high as possible. As you can see here, everything evasion-wise is available to him, but all the heavy stuff is not. So I think that about sums it up. I like keeping a Seal of Vigor on him, but you can use just about anything to keep him going. The regen ability from Hopongo is very, very decent. So that's something that you'd be able to make some pretty darn nifty use of. So we'll go ahead and replace daggers with axes here real quick before I forget. And yeah, you can actually do one-handed spears and a short bow if that's your thing. So for those who don't always remember this, yes. This is something that you can actually do. This is actually a pretty decent setup for him too. Actually, if you want to go one-handed spear and light shield, you can get some amazing evasion going on this guy. So let's say, we give him a Ventisca over here, we give him a light shield over here. Let's go ahead and give him the Wave Breaker, why not? These will go ahead and swap out for, what do we got here? Probably go ahead and go for a Scout Thing. Then we go for a Seal of Evasion, and just how high does that make his evasion? I mean, 299. That is absurdly high. There's friggin' nothing physical is going to hit this guy. So you do this with, like, Reflect Magic and all that sort of thing, you're solid. You're set. Like, this guy is good to go. So you can get some amazing stuff going there. Secondly, there's actually a second unique Hawkman this time around. So if you've heard of the Neutral Trio, they are essentially 3 characters that you get in the neutral route, or can potentially get. Now, Tammuz here, he is a Raven Man, back from the Ogre Battle games. So he's the only one that's actually got access to the heavier classes. Like, for example, if we compare here with a basic Hawkman, pretty much everything they have available, with exception to the Warrior, is mostly lightly armored, and mostly like a hit-and-run type of thing. Whereas Tammuz is the only one that gains access to heavier classes, so he still can be a Warrior and all these basic things, but he can be a Terror Knight, he can be a Berserker, a Hoplite, a Juggernaut, Patriarch, whatever you want on this guy. So, very useful to go through the neutral route to pick him up. Bear in mind, all of these guys, their stats are much more normalized. So, all of the generic units have all their stats pretty well normalized across the board. But, bear in mind that all Hawkman units, all flying units in general, do have a little bit of a stat penalty because of the fact that they can fly. So, alright, I believe he's actually the only one also that's able to do this type of setup because of being a hoplite. So I think he's the only one that can use sidearms and a power fist while flying. If you're unaware of what the deal is with the power fist, it's essentially a type of shield that you can punch and get a stun on, as well as giving yourself a strengthen. So that can potentially be very useful depending on how you do it. I like running to moves with a Void Ring, and heavy armor allows him to be very defensive, but still, you know, reasonably fast. And, alright, I think that more or less covers everything there is to cover about Hawkmen. You know, have fun. Oh, the Songstress! I completely forgot about the Songstress! Yes, okay, there's a reason for that. Namely, she's not very good in the original. So, the Songstress. Now, in the original PSP remake, she was very uninspiring. You got her well past the end of the freaking game. She could kind of become a decent fighter with instruments. It's a weapon class nobody else gets access to. Bear in mind this class was also available to pumpkin heads, as if stuff wasn't oddly specific enough. But yeah, she could become a decent fighter with her instruments. Her songs were basically like an even suckier version, with maybe one or two exceptions, an even suckier version of the war dances from the Swordmaster. Just completely meh across the board, really. But now the One Vision version, you've got stuff like a Superstar here, gets rid of all debuffs and charges TP. You've got Limelight here, which raises luck in an area around her and lowers recovery time. So she can basically raise the crit rate and lower recovery time of the entire area around her. So she's got Absorb and Reflect, if that's your kind of thing. As far as her dances and all that sort of thing go, if we go over here, so we've got, like, right here, we've got a thing that restores TP to everyone in the area, restores MP to everyone in the area. You've got restoring health for everybody in the area as your three basic ones. You've got Spellcraft on everyone, Strengthen on everyone, Spell Strike. All of these essentially will do their opposite as well. So, for example, this one does Spell Strike on all your friends, Spell Slip on all enemies. This one does Strengthen on your guys, Weaken on the other guys. You've got Spellcraft, and then I believe it's Spell Slip or something on your, or Feeble Mind rather, on the opposite end. So Circle of Life heals your guys, damages the other one. Same thing goes for MP and TB for those abilities. You've got the Black Swan, which does True Strike and also reduces enemy accuracy. You've got Spell Strike and Spell Slip. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff here. And then she's also still got access to the war dances as well. So stuff like Strengthen and Dodge on friends, True Strike and Resilient, restores health. This actually does like up to 100 plus health at this point, so it no longer sucks, bear in mind. Cleansing removes a debuff from everybody in the area. You've got a thing that inflicts stun on all enemies, inflicts slow on all enemies, reduces TP of all enemies. And right here, Demon Petal, everyone's favorite, one that'll essentially give charm on an entire area. So if you give her an instrument, you have her fly up to the front, sometimes she'll charm on counter, because instruments actually all have a charm effect on them now. So they have I believe it's 15% chance to charm, but essentially they would be able to charm an enemy on that. They could fly up and they would be able to do a mass charm in an entire area, and she's pretty sturdy on top of all that, even while wearing robes. So she's far more useful than she ever was, and is very, very useful to actually have in your party now. So there we go. I think that covers everything there is to cover about the Wingling folks, and yeah, I think that about covers it. So you have yourself a great day. Hope this was useful and or entertaining, and yeah, make sure to do the whole subscribing thing if you liked it. Take care. Have a good one.